It's e4, c6, knight f3, and after d5, place the knight on c3, and a strong move is knight to f6, simply creating pressure against the pawn on e4. White cannot defend the pawn in this way because after capturing, black would be able to exchange the queens and cost white the right to castle. If white were to capture back with the knight, then the pawn on e4 would be undefended. If white captures the pawn on d5, now black, after recapturing, would have a very, very good position. This would not be a good variation for white. So if white cannot defend with a pawn and he cannot capture for an advantage, all that leaves is the move pawn to e5. After the knight comes to e4, white capturing on e4 is not a threat at all, and that the knight does not have any appealing squares to go to. g5 is a little bit dangerous, while g1, as it's just going right back to its starting square. Knight to h4 would be even worse, since after g5, the knight would have no squares, f5 is covered by the bishop, and f3 is taken as well. Therefore, after knight e4, we do not have to worry about knight takes e4. White has three moves. He can move the pawn once, can move the pawn twice, the move knight to e2, in order to avoid an exchange of knights. Pawn to d4. We can capture the knight, pawn takes knight, pawn to c5, pawn to c4. And it can look quite scary with white having 3 pawns in the center against only 2 for us. But we would play knight to c6, we force him to a decision. Black can just develop with a move pawn to e6, both defending in the center and creating an attack against c5. White has nothing better than to capture, bishop e3, to try and hang on to the pawn. Black can play bishop takes c5, and if white captures, black will be able to play queen a5 check, after which he will recover his piece, and of course he will have taken this pawn. White cannot hang on to the pawn, and white usually just develops bishop d3, the pawn on c5. We've recovered the pawn. Black does have an isolated queen's pawn. It gives him nice central control, and the pawn on e5 for white is also quite vulnerable.